moral obligation. Lauren Palmer, who you saw in a report there, she lost both her parents when she was just 9 years old. What about people in her situation? What about parents who lost their children? I mean, we know that successive governments have, in essence, lied to cover up what was the most fundamental scandal within our health service. It seems pretty clear that those individuals, like Lauren, deserve some form of compensation. Can you give an assurance today that they will be getting something at some point?
So the claims that you make and the eligibility and the scope of where this terrible scandal impacted and what should then happen is exactly what Sir Brian Langstaff is looking at in his inquiry. Now, it will be wrong for me to prejudge that. That will come out next year. He's due to conclude, as I say, in 2023.
I understand.
And once he has,
but it's not the position of the lawyers representing the victims. This is what they've said. The infected blood inquiry continues its good work under Sir Brian Langstaff. However, it would be frustrating if the victims have to wait for the inquiry's final report before a meaningful compensation mechanism is put in place. They continue. They have already waited decades, and this is the key point. Any argument that we need any more evidence of the fact the government must be held to account is now untenable. We know that the government is responsible. We know that these people need compensation. Why can't we simply move forward with
Well, that's why we're making interim payments. Now, you know, we saw the need for that early on in the inquiry. That's why we got Sir Robert Francis to put together this report on a framework for compensation payments. And while he's obviously recommended interim payments, that framework is good for future compensation payments as well. We have to wait for the inquiry to conclude. As I say, infected and bereaved partners will get this money quite quickly over the next few weeks, and then we'll be able to consider, once the inquiry is concluded, the more complicated questions about wider eligibility and what, if any, compensation should be payable. Of
course, the victims of infected blood, they're not the only people who are desperately seeking compensation. So what about those who've been affected by Primados, valproate and mesh? The Cumberland Review 2 years ago recommended that they deserved compensation, and still the government is sitting on its hands. Since then, 23 members of the Primados campaign have died. When will they get compensation?
Well, as I say, today we're concentrating on the infected blood scandal. We'll have to consider more widely these medical events from past years. But, I'm happy to look at that situation as well and see what can be done.
It just feels, again, given the complaints about the length of time it took for the inquiry to even be set up, then for the inquiry to move forward, then having had this interim report passed, having had this compensation report passed to the government, then an argument at the end of it, just feels, again, that the government is dragging its heels. And when people are genuinely dying, week after week after week because of mistakes which were avoidable, these are people who will never receive the compensation that they were due.
Well, look, there's no doubt about it that the many years of campaigning that lots of people put in should not have had to happen, right? There should have been, as far as I could see, an early acknowledgement that there had been an issue, that a tragedy, that a scandal had unfolded. In 2017, obviously, the government did recognise that and instituted the inquiry. We're now moving to fulfil the recommendations on interim payments as quickly as we possibly can, having recognised early on that this was likely to be the case. My job now is to drive that through and make sure the money gets into people's hands as quickly as we possibly can. But look, there are more complicated circumstances than we are currently addressing around eligibility, not just infected and bereaved partners, but there are others, as you said, parents, children, other relatives. Now, that is more complicated, as Sir Brian Langstaff has said in his inquiry, and we will get to them in the end. As remember, this is an interim position. And I'm pleased
get to them in the end. I mean, that's the assurance that people are looking for.
Well, certainly that's where the inquiry is going, right? So when Sir Brian made the recommendations to the government, which we're fulfilling today, he did acknowledge that there would be disappointment in some other groups, that it was more complicated to work out eligibility and scope with them, but that in time we would get there.